just be waiting for a little bit before we begin formally with our session. But anyone who's coming in already, really great to have you all here. We hope to have a really great, insightful session today with our panelists. Hello, Martha. It's nice to have you. Could you also let us know where you're joining us from? Ah, you're from Uganda. Nice to have you with us today. It would be really awesome to hear from other audience members as well who are just starting to come in. Okay, we are going to begin. Hi, Aga, how are you? Nice to have you with us today. Like I said, it would be really nice to hear from our audience where they're joining us from. So please keep leaving where you're from, which profession you're in, your organization. Those kinds of details would be really nice to have from you all, so we know who all is with us in the audience. So welcome once more, and we're very happy to have you on our second webinar for the Global event, which is powered by the Global Education Initiative. The topic of our session today is data-driven decision-making and tech-based practices for public education systems in Pakistan. I'm Hamna Tariq. I manage the education portfolio at SERP, and I will be your host today. We would really love to hear from our audience as they're joining in, so keep typing in your responses in the chat box. Our team is here. We would be reading through them, and would be great to have your questions coming in through as well once we get started with our session. So I will first start by introducing our panelists today. We have two panelists with us. The first is Dr. Christina Brown. She's a distinguished development economist who currently holds the position of assistant professor in the econ department at the University of Chicago. She's affiliated with SERP as a research fellow and a principal investigator. She was one of the lead PIs on targeted instruction program, which we're going to talk at length about in our session today. Dr. Brown's research endeavors focus on labor and education market imperfections, particularly delving into issues related to asymmetric information. Dr. Christina holds a PhD from the University of California, Berkeley, and she has served on the advisory board of the DFID Pakistan KP Education Sector Program Evaluation. A very warm welcome to you, Dr. Christina, and many thanks for joining the webinar today. Our second panelist for this session is Ms. Maliha Hamid. She's currently a Master of International Development Policy candidate and a recipient of the prestigious McCourt Scholar Award at the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown University. Ms. Maliha previously led the learning and education achievements in Pakistani schools, more commonly known as the LEAPS program at SERP, including the Target Instruction Program. Before joining SERP, Ms. Maliha was part of the inaugural team of the Lum School of Education, where she contributed to the launch of the school and its first graduate degree program. Ms. Maliha holds a bachelor's degree in economics and politics from LUMS and is committed to driving social impact through educational innovation at the intersection of policy, research, and practice. Welcome, Ms. Maliha, as well. So before we dive into our session, I quickly want to talk a little bit about the format of this session. We're going to have two presentations from our panelists, and we will leave about 10 to 15 minutes at the end of the session to address audience questions. And as you guys are joining in, like I said, please feel free to type in the chat box any comments, reactions that you have to the discussion that we will be having, also introducing yourself and where you're joining us from. And once we get into the presentations, if you have any specific questions of our panelists, please drop them in the Q&A box below. If you would like to address your question to a specific panelist, please write their name as well, so then we can direct your question to the relevant panelists. So before I hand over to our panelists, I would like to quickly set the stage for this session. As we all are very much aware, Pakistan is facing a learning crisis, which has been consistently reported in the USR reports and also confirmed by SERP's own largest panel data in any developing country context, which we call the LEAPS. Our collective world also faced a global pandemic in 2020, and the biggest concern for all of us coming out, but really the ones who work in the education sector, was what is the learning loss going to be of these extended school closures, right? And we at SERP were already much aware of what learning loss children can have because of the 2000 earthquake disaster, which we worked on quite extensively as well. And we knew that it can be quite difficult for students to catch up. With the support then of the federal ministry, which is the Ministry of Federal Education and Professional Training, and in a very close collaboration with the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa Elementary and Secondary Education Department, we at SERP designed a foundational learning program for targeted instruction, not only as a response to COVID, but also to tackle long-standing learning crisis in Pakistan public schools. So in this session today, our panelists are going to be talking about this program, which we call the Targeted Instruction Program, or more commonly known as the TIP program, and how it was embedded in the education ecosystem. So with that, I will invite our first presenter, Dr. Christina Brown, who's going to focus on the Target Instruction Program. She will specifically talk about the implementation in Islamabad Capital Territory. Dr. Christina will give us an overview of the TIP program. She will discuss intervention and the intervention model, and also share qualitative and quantitative findings of this program. So over to you, Dr. Christina.
Great. I'm very excited to be here and to tell you about this program, and looking forward to your questions at the end. So I'm going to tell you about the ICT, the Islamabad Capital Territory version of the TIP program, and Maliha will get into more detail about the KP version. But there's a lot of kind of similarities between these two programs. The goal of this was really to try to think about how can we tailor instruction to different students' learning levels. In particular, we know that students are going to be, significantly behind due to COVID learning losses. But even in the absence of COVID, we've seen in, a lot of low-income settings that it tends to be the case that students are not at grade level, or that in a lot of cases, there's huge variation. So it might be that, on average, students are at grade level, but there's, a third of students who are behind. In our sample of students, for example, we find that at baseline, students are on average about a full grade level behind, and there's huge variation. So the modal teacher has somewhere between 2 and 3 kind of grade level of students. So a 4th grade teacher might have a third of their class that's at 2nd grade level, a third of their class that's kind of at 3rd grade level in terms of their understanding, and a third of their class that's on track kind of at a 4th grade level, right? So how do we think about supporting teachers that are trying to address these huge variations in kind of learning levels within their classroom? So we did this program in partnership with 500 schools in Islamabad, and about 2,000 teachers and 90,000 students that were involved. We also, as part of the program, really wanted to involve parents and the kind of broader set of caregiver network, because we know that, the time that students spend in the classroom is a huge chunk of the time that they spend on learning, but then they go home and, what happens in those additional hours, right? Are they kind of supported? Is there a relationship between what they're learning in the class and how they're being supported at home? Who are the people that are involved in that process? So part of what we wanted to understand in this program too was, is it just about mothers in this case? Is it about supporting older siblings that are helping their younger siblings with homework? Is it about fathers? Is it about tutors? So we really wanted to kind of understand the broader caregiver landscape and kind of who should we be working with to make sure that there's a cohesive kind of learning and support happening both at what's happening in the classroom and what's happening when they get home. Okay, so the broad kind of tip model that we follow takes kind of a cyclical approach. The first thing we want to just do is understand, okay, where are students at? So we conducted a baseline assessment of students, and importantly, in this assessment, we had students answer questions that were significantly below grade level. So this wasn't kind of just an on grade level assessment. So we had questions that were, significantly remedial, as well as we had some that were, obviously on grade level, but also above grade level to really get a sense of, okay, what is the spread in student abilities within a given classroom? Then what we do is we provide that information back to teachers. So we let them know, okay, for your classroom, these 10 students are significantly below grade level. We recommend a very remedial set of instruction for them. These students are on grade level. These students are maybe just a little bit behind. And so we try to support them and let them know, okay, here's where students' ability levels are. The other thing we wanted to do was really give detailed information, because it's not just, whether a student is on average struggling in math, but what in particular are they struggling with, right? Are they struggling with division or fractions, or they're really struggling with, carrying? What is the specific unit and SLO that the children struggled with? So along with kind of giving them information about broadly sorting them into ability groups, this was tailored at the unit level. So this isn't about students' kind of average performance, but their specific content knowledge on that topic. Then what we did is say, okay, for this next kind of month and a half period, we're going to have this kind of big push remedial activity where students are going to be given instruction based on whatever level we sorted them into. Now, one thing we wanted to do with the Islamabad version of the program is that there are existing programs like TARL, Teaching at the Right Level, that focus on this idea of kind of sorting students and then splitting them up based on their ability level. So rather than, organizing students by age, which is typically how schools are mostly structured, splitting them by what is their learning level, and then having, groups based on understanding and having a teacher teach for each of these. That can be tricky to get, schools on board with, having kind of this reallocation of students, having kids who are very different ages in the same classroom. And so what we wanted to do was basically say, okay, kids can stay in their regular classroom. They can stay in their regular fourth grade classroom like they were before. But we're going to have kind of 3 different levels of material based on what group you were sorted into. So the teacher can still teach, the multiplication lesson, but there's going to be kind of the significantly remedial version, the slightly remedial, and then the on grade level version of that content. So during these 40 days, teachers would be given kind of 3 versions of the lesson plans, so that way students are getting exactly what they need, but we're not having to kind of reshuffle students. And then we give kind of unit level assessments to give feedback back to teachers to let them know, okay, what was it that students mastered? Do we need to do another day of remediation, and so on? Okay. And then we did a few things to kind of get teachers on board with this process, because this is a really big difference in terms of how they're spending their time, how they're allocating their kind of instruction within the classroom. So we did a set of trainings with teachers, and then we also had a tech tool to basically be giving them this information about what are students' baseline levels of learning, what are the things that they've mastered, and then ongoing kind of have they mastered the additional topics as instruction continues. So I'll just give you a little bit of an overview of what this tech tool looked like for teachers. We can also, in the Q&A, if you have questions about how we took into account the fact that for a lot of these teachers, they don't have great bandwidth. Maybe they have intermittent internet connection at their schools. We thought they were trying to tailor this to that setting, as well as there's huge variation in teachers' kind of use of technology, comfort with technology, and so on. So we tried to do a lot to kind of tailor it to that audience. So opening up the dashboard, you have a pretty simple home screen. Because we wanted to basically see how students were progressing over the length of these 40 days, teachers were administering quizzes to their students. They could either directly input the scores of students, or we also allow them to take a picture of the test and then we graded it for them. Then they had information about kind of the sorting of students. So in this example group, we have, maybe some students who were absent on the day of the test or have dropped out. And so we don't have a group reading for them. And then we have these three kind of color groups that we have based on, what were the students' learning levels. And then they can see kind of this detailed information about for each quiz, for each skill, what is the specific things that they have mastered, right? So maybe they're struggling with fractions, but they've nailed division. And then we had a series of instructional videos too, of basically best practices on covering different topics so that they had these resources in addition to review as they were preparing for their lessons. Okay, so jumping into, what were the effects of this program? Did it seem to work? What was the difference? So this is, a relatively short program. It was about a month and a half that we were interacting with students. And overall, we find quite positive effects. I will just draw your attention to the fact that this is a shortened access, so this isn't from 0 to 100. But we find for the intervention was targeted for second, third, and fourth graders. We find effects across all grades, and the biggest effects, quite large effects for fourth grade and kind of decreasing as you go down into the younger grades. And that kind of makes sense because second graders in general didn't have as much within classroom variation in their level, whereas as you get into the later grades, basically the spread in student learning levels within a given classroom increases. And so it's these, later classes, third, fourth, fifth grade, where teachers are really having to, do something to kind of deal with the huge variation in learning levels. And this program allowed them to really support the students who were below grade level. So we see that even though this is only about a month and a half of instructional time, students are about a fifth of a grade ahead of the students that were in the control group. So this is a quite substantial increase in their learning that happens during this time period. The other thing that's very interesting is that we find that the effects are twice as big for those who were below average at baseline than those who were on grade level. So we still find positive effects for those kids who were on grade level or above grade level. There's a few kids who are above. But the biggest effects are really for those kids who are behind, who up to this point really have been just receiving on grade level instruction. And so they're basically having to kind of, try to keep up with material that they're just not ready to be mastering yet. And so for these kids who are significantly behind, being able to incorporate this remedial material as part of the normal instruction, I think was really helpful in getting them, to catch up as much as possible. The other interesting thing, we weren't sure basically because there was a lot of technology involved in this intervention, whether there would be certain types of teachers that would benefit more or less. And we find, pretty substantial effects really all across the experience distribution. So this is the effect of the program, the green here relative to the control group. And we see that, for all of the different teacher age levels, we find a positive effect of the program. And there's quite, large effects for, for very experienced teachers, which is encouraging. We weren't sure, for teachers who are, have been teaching for a long time, one, they might just be resistant to a new program, but two, they might not be using the tech tool if they're not as comfortable with technology. But we don't find that. It seems like, they were able to pick this up decently well, and we see the effects in terms of students' learning levels. So that's, was encouraging. And even for novice teachers too, we see, a positive effect of the program. The other thing is that we had two different types of schools that we were working with. We had FDE schools, which were the traditional public schools, and then BEX schools, which are kind of local neighborhood schools that are much lower resourced. and typically are kind of single teacher or maybe two teachers for the entire primary school. So they have large classes, multi-grade classes that they're teaching. And we find that the effects are really concentrated amongst the traditional public schools. This was a little bit disappointing to us because we thought, especially in the Beck schools and these kind of large multi-grade schools where teachers are having to really deal with a lot of different learning levels, maybe this program would be helpful. What we found was that because we were still doing this all within grade level, they were then having to do 3 different versions of 4th grade, along with also teaching, 3rd grade and 2nd grade and all the different versions. So it was just a lot to manage for that, which is understandable. And I think maybe the kind of traditional version of sorting students based on ability level rather than age might work well in this context, or maybe a combination of the teaching at the right level TARL model plus the TIM model could potentially be beneficial in that setting. And so now we're trying to think about, maybe doing a 2nd year of this program to try to, make further improvements to potentially either tailor it to schools like Beck's or to, continue to expand the effectiveness. And then just in my last couple minutes, one thing that I wanted to kind of highlight too, and we can talk about in a little bit more detail, was how teachers and parents interacted with this program. So I didn't talk too much, but what we did with parents was, along with sending teachers information about what students' learning levels were and what they mastered, we also sent text messages to parents, as well as audio recordings to parents to let them know, okay, on this day, here's the topic that was covered in class. Here's what page of the workbook you should do to support your students' learning. Here's the content that they're struggling with. They're weak on this aspect of division. Work with them on these pages of the workbook to support them on this particular topic. So we tried to give really prescriptive instructions to parents about what their students were learning. In general, parents found these messages quite helpful. And one thing that was that we did was kind of tailor the framing of some of the messages too, to be more kind of positive framed or negative framed, or comparing to other students in the class. And in general, people found the kind of positively framed messages more encouraging. One thing that we found in talking to parents after is that, understandably, parents are under a lot of stress, right? They have a lot going on. And so these messages, for some people felt like, okay, this is just one more thing to do, right? This is just one more thing that I'm learning that, my kid is struggling in this topic, so I got to support him in this way. And so framing it in kind of a positive way of saying we want you to be a partner in your child's learning, trying to kind of, treat them as really a partner in this process rather than something antagonistic, I think was really helpful in getting them to feel like, okay, I can make a difference. I can really help my child, and here's what I need to do. So that was really helpful for us to understand kind of, what is the right kind of tone to use in these messages. It could have been that the negative framing was more effective, right? Because then, students or parents are really motivated to help their kid because they feel like, oh, this is really serious. It's really important. But if anything, it was kind of demotivating for parents to kind of hear that framing of messages. Oops. The other kind of qualitative feedback that we got was that there were a few things in particular that teachers really found useful from this program. In particular, a lot of them really liked the workbook materials that we put together. So because we were asking them to basically do this kind of 3 versions of instruction, right? So we were telling them, okay, here's the different levels of students. And when you're teaching a given topic, like 2-digit multiplication, here's how you do the kind of very basic version. Here's how you do the middle version. Here's how you do the on grade level version. And then here's a workbook which has basically problems for the basic group to work on, the intermediate group to work on, and the advanced group to work on. And teachers really, really liked having that material because they were able to basically, up till then, their normal textbook just had on grade level material, right? So if they had to do anything that was remedial, they would have to either create their own, sets of problems or worksheets or something like that for kids. Or they would just say, hey, if you're behind, we're just going to have you do the on grade level material. So having that kind of remedial material was very nice, and also structuring it in a way so that it was very easy for them to say, okay, here's today's lesson. In the workbook, kids in the blue group, you're going to do page 11. Kids in the green group, you're going to do page 12. Kids in the yellow group, you're going to do page 14. It was very easy for them to kind of translate that difference in ability levels to what are the students actually going to be working on. They also liked that we had it. It was basically like a traditional workbook where kids can write directly in it. And again, they really liked that kind of structure of materials. And so I think there was a lot of kind of lessons just from the kind of nitty gritty details of how we did that that can probably be drawn for other settings that are not doing teaching at the right level. Okay, and then one thing in the last minute I think that I have is that one thing that we found that was important, and I think something to think through going forward, is that while in general, feedback was quite positive from teachers, we find that, most of them, the vast majority of them felt like this was helpful in getting kids caught up. It was helpful in giving them information about students' learning levels. They did find it burdensome, right? So this is, a new set of lesson plans that they're going to be using. It's requiring them to do different things with different kids in their classroom, potentially having them kind of move seats if they wanted to have the kind of colored groups sitting all together in an area. And so that's quite a lot for teachers to take on when they already maybe have quite large classrooms. There's a lot going on and so on. And so one thing we're trying to think through going forward is, how can we do this in a way that teachers want to opt into this, right? So, it could be the case that, if teachers see that, this makes their job easier, it's really effective for students, it actually, is easier than having to do their own lesson plans, then they're going to want to do it on their own, right? They're going to have the kind of, interest to and be motivated to do it themselves because they see that it saves them time in the long run, it's really helpful for their students and so on. And so figuring out ways to basically, one, show them the effectiveness of it, and two, have it be saving them time in some ways, I think is going to be really important going forward to really make sure that this is something that teachers want to participate in, and this isn't really like being pushed from outside, because then you're not going to be able to get kind of long run change if this is something that you're really having to kind of force teachers to engage in year after year. So I'll leave it at that, and looking forward to your questions later. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Christina, for your very interesting presentation. Just for folks who are joining us now or may have joined us a little bit late, Dr. Christina presented on a foundational learning targeted instruction program, which is called the TIP program, implemented in ICT. And one of the big findings that are coming out of it is that the program was impactful in reducing learning gaps, adding about 1/5 of a year of learning. And this program was embedded within the regular schooling system. Christina, we have just a couple of questions which we can take before we move on to the next presentation. The first question that we have is, did you have a comparison group just to help understand the counterfactual?
Yeah, I should have, since it was such a short presentation, I didn't talk about it in detail, but yes. So we randomized schools and teachers to different interventions. And so the graphs that I showed you where there was the red bar versus the green bar, the red bar is the control group. So these were randomized to receive the kind of status quo, which was a kind of basic version where teachers got kind of basic training, but not much else. And then the green bars were the ones that were randomized into the program. And so this was an RCT.
Okay. We do have a few more questions, but let's move to the second presentation, and we have time at the end of this session for Q&A. So please keep typing in your questions in the Q&A box that we have here or in the chat box. We will be keeping note of them, and we'll ask these panelists questions once we are done with the second presentation. So with that, we will move to the second presentation, which Maliha is going to present. She will shed light on the approach that the research and the program team took to embed the targeted instruction program into the existing education ecosystem. She's going to talk about a 5-step approach informed by the large-scale pilot, which was conducted in KP. And Maliha will give us an overview of the TIP KP pilot program. She will talk about the methodology and also walk us through the 5-step approach to embed a foundation learning program in the education ecosystem. So over to you, Maliha.
Thank you, Hamna. And thank you, Christina, for the great context setting and presentation on TIP. Thanks, everyone, for joining in. I'm super excited to be sharing insights and lessons from embedding a large-scale foundational learning program and study in the Pakistan education ecosystem. For reference, this is the same TIP program that Christina talked about, but the geographical focus is the northwestern province of Pakistan, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. And as Christina mentioned, the programs were broadly similar, with some variations in the KP version to fit local context and to address some of the research study questions. So the pressing question before us is, why embed a large-scale foundational learning program with an impact evaluation in public service delivery? And the answer lies in the two global themes around the role of evaluation. Number one, in enhancing or supporting the understanding of stakeholders about the processes of transformational change, as they call it. And number two, as a platform to push policy solutions that would contribute to the transformational change. The key word here really is embeddedness. And we believe that embeddedness can achieve two goals. One is effectiveness and efficacy of the program and impact evaluation implementation at the pilot phase. But beyond that, it really ensures persistence of reform efforts. So today I will be talking about the how of embedding TIP in the Pakistan public education ecosystem with a specific focus on the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa landscape. Again, to emphasize, I will be focusing, my presentation focuses on Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, the northwestern province of Pakistan, where we brought TIP between 2021 and 2023. It was a massive, large-scale pilot study. So it had a programmatic part, and then it also had an inbuilt impact evaluation. The sample included 1,250 public primary schools in 2 districts, of which 250 were pure control schools that did not do the program. And then the remaining 1,000 did the program, and they were randomized into 4 different groups based on a sort of technology usage that they had to carry out. The key outcomes we were interested in, number one, student test scores, because we wanted to see how the program was impacting learning needs, learning outcomes. And then number 2, teacher level tech take-up of the tech tool. So how did we embed TIP in KP education ecosystem? We started off with what we call the systems level thinking framework. It's a product of a longitudinal study, which goes by the name LEAPS. In this footnote, you can visit the website and read more about LEAPS and this framework. But building on this, we really wanted to think about and map out the different stakeholders that are in the KP education ecosystem, identify them, understand who these actors are and what the interlinkages between their interactions are. And then through that, we arrived at what we call the 5-step approach to embedding TIP. And what we really did differently in this project was to shift gears from a solely economist approach to an engineering approach or a plumber mindset. And we adopted this throughout the project life. So just for some context, this hand-drawn sketch or organogram it just illustrates the complexity of the KP education ecosystem. You see somewhat of a similar organogram for all the other provinces. And I'll dive into each of these parts in the next slides. But before I do that, one thing which we realized early on was that the diagnostic test results, which is the first step in the TIP process, that showed that majority of the students from grades 1 through 5, they were absolutely in need for remediation. And then there was also global evidence which showed promise of foundational learning programs, but just global and local evidence were not enough to catalyze support for TIP across the education ecosystem. So early on, we realized that there were 2 things we needed to work towards. 1, system level alignment, and number 2, really ensuring that there was teacher-level ownership and support. And to work towards these two, we started off our initial system-level engagements at the political level. Education is a devolved subject in Pakistan, but provinces, they still look at the federal ministry at the center to follow suit when it comes to new reform efforts that are introduced. So we use the federal ministry and got buy-in from them through the involvement of international development partners. And the reason it was important for us to involve the federal ministry in this whole engagement is because, number one, a lot of foreign funding flows from the center to provinces, and number two, the federal capital has historically been a test bed for new reform initiatives. So this seemed like a reasonable first step in our system-level engagements. And this organogram zooms into the KP provincial education ecosystem, or rather the KP government landscape, if you may call it. And so using the federal ministry buy-in as a lever, we garnered support from our primary client here, which is the KP Education Elementary and Secondary Education Department. And besides this department, we were also engaging with other external bureaucracies, for example, the Home Department for security clearances, because there was foreign funding involved. Again, it was not just enough to just engage with high-level bureaucracy. So we had to go one step down to middle-tier management. These are the sub-attached departments of the KP Elementary and Secondary Education Department. And they oversee, for example, school establishment, training, monitoring, and curriculum. And it was important for us to gain their buy-in because ultimately they were the gatekeepers to whatever we were going to do in schools. The district education authorities was another entity that was really important in the whole process of taking TIP into schools. And then last but not the least, our frontline workers, head teachers and teachers, to whom we trickled down all the way from the top. And they were the final node in the chain of command of TIP implementation. I do want to point out here that this whole process of engaging with the system was not a top-down, bottom-up approach. We were really going every which way, really like poking into each and every part of the system to ensure that there was buy-in across different stakeholders. And so once we'd mapped the whole system, this 5-step approach really helped us embed TIP in the KP education landscape. And there were 5 steps that we took. Number one, we identified frictions in the system both at the system level and then also at the teacher level. And then we created a shared purpose and aligned everyone around that. We mobilized every layer and tier of the system. And what was really important was to create synergies with current or existing practices. And then while we were doing all of this, we were very mindful about being iterative in this whole process. So there are many systemic frictions, but 3 that stood out particularly to us were, number one, a repeated and unregulated transfer of bureaucrats, both at the high level, so at the secretarial level, and then also at the teacher and the education management cadre level. The second is this excessive reliance on old-style paper communication, because of which a lot of messages go lost in translation. And the third is what we call the power or the chronicle of CC, which is this constant debate about who has to be copied on what correspondence in order to ensure an information-rich environment. And if people are not copied, you can assume that an activity or a program would end up not happening, or there would be many hurdles in it. So at the teacher level, there's a common perception that teachers do not carry out their responsibilities, that they indulge in shirking or gaming the system. And as Christina showed in her qualitative insights, we also found out from baseline surveys in KP that teachers' beliefs were really aligned with TIP's goal of meeting students where they are. And so it was really important for us to take a step back from this typical perception and really think about what are the inevitable forms of divergence or constraints, as we call it, and why might these occur, and how is it that they come in the way of teachers taking up a program like TIP, even though they really believe that it's important for them as well as students. And so starting from the bottom, the first constraint that we noticed is what I call administrative burdens or high transaction costs, as Christine also mentioned, of taking in a new program because it requires time, it requires learning. The second is misaligned incentives and weak governance structures. So for example, the Independent Monitoring Unit, which is affiliated with the KP Education Department, monitors teacher performance. And if they share the data with the district, with the Deputy Commissioner Office, which is completely unrelated to the Education Department, and that department then produces a report on district ranking. Now, the teachers are reporting to the Education Department, but their performance evaluation or the reporting on that is being produced by a completely different entity based on curriculum completion. So there's a little bit of a dissonance or a disconnect between who they're reporting to versus who is conducting their evaluations. The third constraint is what literature calls a collective principles problem, which results in a tug-of-war-like situation. So for example, when we were taking TIP in, teachers believed in it, the department was on board, but the monitoring unit and the parents, they were more keen on curriculum completion than meeting student learning needs. The fourth problem or the fourth constraint is the multi-dimensional role of a teaching profession. Teachers are spread too thin. They have administrative duties, they have teaching duties, and it's not administrative duties only within the school. They have to be involved in polling duties, they have to take pictures of dengue sites and whatnot. So they're in a difficult position to take up something new, or they're sort of forced, even if they don't want to not comply to anything new or take up anything new. And to address each of these constraints, we used the 5-step approach and worked with the relevant departments to craft alleviation strategies just to ensure that each of these constraints was addressed in some way before the program was taken in. And so this brings us to the second step, which is aligning the system around a shared purpose. Fortunately, COVID even though it was a catastrophe, we used it as a pivot to opportunity to really realign the system around learning as a priority. The second thing we did was anchoring the TIP program in a donor-funded, government-led national COVID recovery program, and that ensured guaranteed funding, and it ensured continuity of the program. We also got approval from the federal ministry for the TIP materials, the curriculum, the assessments, and then we used this federal ministry buy-in or willingness to take the program across Pakistan as a lever to gain buy-in from the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa Ministry and Education Department. And luckily, they were very receptive, and they wanted to think of TIP not just as a COVID response strategy, but also as a regular feature of public schools. And so to ensure and create an enabling environment for TIP implementation, they induced certain policy changes. The first thing they did was they dedicated a slot for TIP classes in math, English, and Urdu for 40 consecutive days. Number two, they suspended the regular curriculum in these 3 subjects so that the focus could just be on remediation and catching students up. The third thing was shifting focus of monitoring from curriculum completion to learning growth. And the fourth thing, which is quite impressive, was adapting the centralized grade 5 exams, which are used for promotional purposes. They're high stakes exams, adapting them to only cover the content which grade 5 students had actually learned during this time when they were enrolled in the TIP. The third step was really mobilizing the entire system, and we did this in 3 ways. We had focal points who were our champions at different tiers of the system. we engaged with them continuously throughout the program, not just at the beginning and the end, but they were really our people who we were going to as co-thinkers and as co-designers of the program. Wherever possible, we reciprocated the support government was extending to us, and we did this by, for example, the government had some questions, research-related questions, or they needed technical support somewhere. Wherever we could, we tried extending that to them. The last thing which we did, which is really important, was to offer non-financial incentives to stakeholders. And we did that by involving relevant stakeholders as owners and co-designers of the TIP program from the get-go. So for example, questions like, how many days should the program be? How should a dedicated slot be built into the regular timetable? How should sorting happen? All of these were decided with the relevant stakeholders, as opposed to just putting together a plan in our offices and imposing that on them. One other non-financial incentive was really giving teachers the support that they required, which would address the constraints that they were facing. And we did that in 3 different ways, or 2 different ways. We gave them ready-to-use tools, easy-to-use tools, which were available both in hard form and in electronic forms. These were assessments, teaching learning materials, a technology tool, training materials, which they had handy all the time. They didn't have to put in effort to create these. These were standardized materials that they could just pick out, open, and just deliver in classrooms. And the other thing which we did was set up this teacher support mechanism. So as Christina mentioned, there was a 2-tier cascaded training of trainers who then went on and trained teachers. And then there was ongoing support through mentorship and technology tool. And the mentorship piece is a really important and interesting one. And it's something which we offered, or we sort of integrated into our program on the request of relevant stakeholders. So when we had our first focus group discussion with these stakeholders, one thing which they said was that a lot of programs come in, they train us, and then they just leave us to our devices. And that's what really breaks the program. So they said that for TIP to be successful, you need to be there with us throughout, whether it's 1 year or 2 years. And so ideally, we would have used the education managers who fall under the District Education Authority, but due to limited capacity within the department, and upon their request, we infused a cadre of 15 mentors who worked very closely with the education managers, so building their capacity for the scale-up phase, and then working very closely with teachers and head teachers to take the program in. And interestingly, we saw this trustworthy local community of practice emerge, where teachers, mentors, and education managers were also interacting outside school life. The 4th step, even though this was a pilot study, but for the 4th step is something we were really mindful of not to unnecessarily create temporary structures or parallel structures if resources and personnel existed already. So we were really latching on to processes and practices within the system. And 3 examples of these are, number 1, the training model and modality. We adopted whatever the department was using for pre-service and in-service and continuous professional development training. We did not want to just impose something which we had created because that wouldn't have worked. We used their master trainers as well. The second thing was we wanted to make sure that the teachers who were doing TIP, they were constantly undergoing some sort of a refresher on the TIP content, even though they had the training materials with them. And so we integrated the TIP academic planning sessions in monthly continuous professional development days, which the KP Education Department has set. And the last thing was building capacity of the education managers, or locally called ASDOs, who were tied up with the mentors, really learning and observing how they did their duties as a preparation for to take up this role in the scale-up phase. The last step is to be iterative, to adapt, and to constantly try if something doesn't work in the first go. And to really keep at the back of your mind that implementation is not linear, especially when it's a massive, large-scale pilot, and not just of a program, but also has a study included in it in a public education ecosystem. With this, my presentation comes to an end. Looking forward to chatting with you about your questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Maliha, for your insightful presentation. We have a few questions that have come in. We will start taking them. Christina, the first couple of questions are to you, but Maliha, of course, you've been a part of the program, so feel free to answer them as well. So the two questions are, what sort of challenges came up when we tried to split the students? And the second one is, how did the students react when they were divided into groups? Did it develop any inferiority, superiority complexes in the process or not?
Yeah, so I would say that this wasn't a perfect approach, though we felt that it was preferred to the alternative, which is basically splitting kids based on ability level and then grouping them based on that. So having kids that are, different ages kind of grouped together based on ability level. We thought that that would create more of those kind of negative reactions. I would say in general for the younger kids, like second grade and so, they weren't kind of as aware of what was going on, partly because what we did was we had them have color groups that they were assigned to, rather than it wasn't kind of explicit that this was an ability group. Though for the fourth graders and so on, they kind of pieced it together hey, I know this, the couple smart kids that I know that are in the class are all in the blue group, maybe that means something. The other thing that we did too was that these groups changed for each unit based on students' mastery level. And so what ended up happening was oftentimes for the first couple units, place value addition, most of the kids would be in the kind of on grade level or maybe one grade level group behind. So we didn't always have three groups. It was really based on what fraction of kids are in, each group. And then by the time it got to, the fractions unit, a lot of the kids would have been in the lower group that needed a lot of remediation. And so there was kind of this variation. It wasn't this kind of static, hey, for the next 2 months, you're kind of, tagged as being a low performer. So we tried to make it, both less explicit and also just much more dynamic. And so I think those two factors helped to make it not be as kind of salient. And at least in talking to teachers afterwards, that wasn't a first order concern that they brought up, that there was a lot of kind of backlash from students. I think, again, a few of the older students kind of knew some of the, included what was going on, but it wasn't a huge pushback. We also, when we talked to parents, didn't hear pushback to that either.
That's great. Maliha, would you like to respond?
To the same question?
Yeah.
I guess one point I want to add is, maybe Christina mentioned it, but these groups were also colored. So we weren't saying, well, you're in level 1 and you're in level 2, but instead we went with colors, so green, orange, yellow. And so kids never knew what level they were really in. So that's sort of anonymized and, sort of shielded any sort of, psychological effects just knowing being in a particular level or lower level would have had.
Another question that we have is, what key indicators were we looking at here, qualitative and quantitative both?
I don't know if you can give a follow-up, but is this, are you asking about key indicators in terms of outcomes, so kind of impacts of the program? Or key indicators in terms of how we did the sorting of students and how we determined kind of what group kids would be in. Maybe this
we don't have a follow-up here. Martha, this is your question, so feel free to clarify for us. But my understanding is it may be the outcomes that they're talking about, but Martha, please let us know.
I can talk about the outcomes in the meantime, and then Martha, feel free to, if I'm not addressing the question, to give a follow-up. So there was a couple things that we were interested in measuring. So at Nline, we measured, student learning levels. So we had kind of detailed assessments where we had objective level, not objective, SLO, so student learning objectives. measure, so we know exactly, have they mastered, two-digit addition with carrying, like very specific level indicators of mastery. So that's one measure that we were looking at. We also tested students in English and Urdu because we were wondering if there would be spillover effects on other subjects. We were just doing our program in math, but we wanted to make sure, one, that it wasn't now that teachers were taking time away from their English and Urdu classes as a result of this. Or you can imagine the other way that, students are feeling more confident in math, they're getting better support there, and so then they have more time to work on other subjects too. So we weren't sure kind of if there would be other effects on other subjects, so we measured that. And then we had really detailed information of what was happening in the classroom. This is, both kind of an outcome of interest to us, but also kind of an intermediary channel that we wanted to understand how are teachers changing their instruction. So we did the Teach Classroom Observation tool, which is a public tool that the World Bank has made accessible. If you go to their website, they have details on it. And so we know, how much time teachers were spending on different types of pedagogy. We have information of kind of what strategy they were using. We also recorded, we basically picked kind of 3 random students within the classroom and had observers record how much time of the class students were spending on actual material. Because one thing we wanted to capture was like, in the status quo, we see that for students who are really behind, they tend to kind of check out halfway through the lesson, right? It's really going over their head. It's hard for them to keep up. And so they're maybe only spending half of the lesson really engaging in any work. And so we wanted to capture, like, are those kids now just spending much more time working on something because they have something that's at the right level for them? So we also captured that as well too.
Thank you so much, Christina. And Martha did confirm she wanted to know about the outcomes and impacts. So that's great. We also have another question. Was the tech infrastructure used as part of the government infrastructure, or were there external applications used? How do we ensure sustainability of the program if external applications are used in the pilot? I think the first, Christina, you can certainly speak to, and Maliha, if you have any response to ensuring sustainability of the program, would be great to hear from you as well. So Christina, can you respond to the first part, which is, was the tech infrastructure government owned or was an external resource developed?
Yeah, so this was a app that we developed for the program specifically. I think the hope is that this is something that we could potentially hand over to the government too, so they could, completely adopt it. But yeah, Maliha, if you have thoughts on kind of how you view the sustainability long term and what this looks like for kind of both the kind of tech components as well as the non-tech components, so like the workbook and other features of the program, like how do we get that to be embedded in the government systems? Malia, if you have thoughts.
Yeah, so for the pilot phase, even though, it was pretty large scale, but for the pilot phase, we wanted to make sure that we were closely monitoring what worked and what did not work in the tech infrastructure. And so it was an external application that was being run by an in-house team at the Center for Economic Research in Pakistan. For scale-up or sustainability, it's something which can easily get integrated into any government system. There were discussions around it. There were discussions around maybe making it a public, making the materials a public good. Again, they have been hosted at least on the KP Education Department website. And the tech tool itself is something which can be easily integrated because it's just a website. So as long as, you can create a host or a sister web page, you can easily integrate the whole system into that. We haven't followed through on it, but there is a scale up or a sustainability plan in works at KP, and we should have something more on this in a year's time.
That's great. We are left with just, we're going, we had just enough time to address one more question, and then we should be closing our session soon. The question is, how did we navigate literacy and language challenges of parents? Christina, Maliha, feel free to take that question.
Christina, feel free to come in on this. I'm just jogging up my memory from last year, but from what I remember, We went through a whole lot of it was certainly complicated, but we had multiple focus group discussions first with parents to understand what languages they would be most comfortable in. And this is ICT, so it was both the traditional schools as well as the informal, non-formal neighborhood schools. For the traditional schools, the parents were much more used to say Urdu, which is the national language. In the non-formal neighborhood schools, they were speaking different languages. And so we did a survey to determine and had focus group discussions to determine what were the languages that were most spoken. And then the messages that were going out, they were translated into languages that the parents were speaking. So we made sure that they were not getting it in a language that they wouldn't understand, whether it was a call or a text message.
Yeah, and the other thing too, exactly, is that we both had the text message information, but because literacy rates were low, especially for these neighborhood schools, we also had an audio recorded call that had that information. So we only had, maybe for each topic that had to go out, maybe like 10 different combinations of messages that needed to be sent. So we had someone record that information, and then they would get kind of an audio recorded call. And we got good feedback too from the parents afterwards about, oh, that audio recorded call should come like, a little bit after work time so that they're likely to pick up the phone, and maybe have the same audio recording like call twice, like, back to back, 2 hours later or something, so they don't miss it if they miss the first one and so on. So things like that to make sure that, at least from the language component, the calls were extremely popular. They found that really useful. And then the thing that we need to, I think, continue to tweak is like at what time, how frequently, and those kinds of features. But the audio recording made a huge difference.
Right. So thank you so much. We are just a little over time, so I will just make a couple of closing remarks. Thank you so much again, Maliha and Christina, for joining us today. The discussion that we have had with you has been quite insightful, and thank you to our audience for their great questions as well. If you're more interested in learning about the LEAPS work, I've just posted a link to the website that you can follow. All of the interventions that we've worked on, you can find there, including the TIP program. We continue to update this website as our research papers come out or materials that become public. So that's a great resource for you to have. And other than that, if you're interested in continuing this conversation, please continue to follow us on the CLEAR PCA's social media page. Again, the link is in the chat box.